Hello, friends. Yay, there we go. Can you hear me all right? Let me know if you can hear me okay. We'll see if the sound works, if everything's working. As per usual, we got to make sure everything's working right. Hello, people in the chat. Noah got first comment. Hi, Noah. Yay, Brian says all good. So if anybody's having trouble hearing me, let me know. I'll fiddle with the mics. We'll figure it out. Hello, Noah and Goldenheart and Brian and Nikki and Carolyn. I'm so glad you're here, and everybody else that's watching. I'm so glad you're here tonight. We are doing Trans and Christian Bible Study. And I always manage to sit on the corner of a table where I'm smacking into the table and making noise, so I'll try not to do that too much. I'm so glad y'all are here. This week, we are talking about some really cool folks who you may not have heard of or heard about in our Bible study. You may not have heard about them in general. Their story is kind of told in a couple of different bits and pieces throughout the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. So because it's not all in one place, it's hard for us to just like read through their story. So we're going to be reading 3 different short sections about a group of women tonight who are really interesting characters, I think. So I hope that this will be a fun one. We're going to be talking about what it looks like to sort of advocate for ourselves and for equality and equity and justice. And yeah, there's just this really great example of people in the Bible who do that. And so I thought we'd talk about them. So that's the plan. We are going to start out just getting to know these folks. We are going to start out in Numbers, which sometimes I think when people think about the book of Numbers, they think like, oh, okay, more rules. Like people kind of think, well, I suppose Numbers and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, all 3 have the sort of, what's the word? They have the reputation of being just like one, do not, or do this over and over and over, just legal stuff. And so people tend to not think of there being very many narratives in those books, but there are a couple. And so we're going to be looking at one of those narratives in Numbers, in the book of Numbers, chapter 27. So if you have a Bible that you like to use to read along with all this stuff and look at differences in translation, we're going to be looking at Numbers chapter 27. That's where we're going to start. And as per usual, I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version, the NRSV, but you can read in whatever translation you like. And I'm always interested to hear differences in translation. So if we're going along and you're like, hey, this word seems quite different from the word that you just said, I would love to hear about it, and we'd love to talk about it a little bit. So Numbers chapter 27 is what we're starting with, and we're reading verses 1 through 11. So that's what we're going to start with. So, yay. Hi, Robin. Glad to see you. So Numbers chapter 27, 1 through 11 is where we're going to start. And we're going to be reading about the group that we usually call the daughters of Zelophehad, which I'm going to have to say a lot in this Bible study, and it's going to be rough, but we're going to do it. Hi, Alex. Good to see you. I'm glad you can make it for a bit. So the daughters who have their own names, and that's gonna be important and something we're going to talk about. But let's get introduced to them. So I'm going to start reading Numbers chapter 27, starting in verse 1, and I'm going to read verses 1 through 11. So it goes like this. Then the daughters of Zelophehad came forward. Zelophehad was son of Hepher, son of Gilead, son of Malchir, son of Manasseh, son of Joseph, a member of the Manassite clans. The names of his daughters were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they said, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the company of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the company of Korah, but died for his own sin, and he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? Give to us a possession among our father's brothers." So that's where we're going to stop in our first reading here. And we're going to kind of get a little bit of history on these women. Yay. Oh my gosh. Okay. 2 things in the chat. First of all, Adriana, I'm so glad I could help. Thank you for being here. I'm glad you're here. And Noah, that's so exciting that you have that name connection. Yes, it's a great name. Noah is a wonderful name. And we always think of Noah of like Noah and the ark, but in the Bible, Noah can also be a name for women too. So it's pretty sweet. So we're introduced to these women here. Mahlah, Noah. It's like in my translation here, it spells Hoglah's name Hogla. And so you might be like, how do you pronounce that? But in the Hebrew, it would be closer to Hoglah, like Hag. So anyways, we've got these wonderful women here, Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. And they are coming before Moses and the priest, and they say, our father died and had no sons, and he didn't die, like God didn't kill him on purpose. He just died of old age. And he had no sons, so we should be able to inherit our father's land, right? Our father's possessions, because we have no brothers. So that's the start of this story. So before we even go any further into this story, let's just take a sec to think about a couple things. One of the things that I didn't think about until I was reading more about this text this afternoon is the way that we so often call these women, the daughters of Zelophehad, and that we don't actually say their actual names. And that's because, one, it's their names. Other than Noah, they're not names that we're super familiar with. Maybe they might sound a little bit like strange to us. And so we think like, oh, I don't know how to pronounce them. I don't know how to say them right. And so sometimes we just kind of skip over their names. But I was reading in Dr. Will Gaffney has this really wonderful book called Womanist Midrash, and she went through the first few books of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, and she talks about all the women in these books. And so this is a great resource for thinking and talking about women in these books. And in the section on these women, she specifically talks about how important it is for us to say their actual names rather than just calling them the daughters of Zelophehad, because we get so few women in the Bible in comparison to the number of men in the Bible that to say like, well, these names are kind of hard to pronounce and we don't know how to say them, and so we're just not going to do it. That's kind of a bummer to like miss out on these wonderful names. So Dr. Gaffney here says, according to Carol Myers, of the 1,426 personal names that appear in the Hebrew Bible, 1,315 are or are presumed to be male, which means there are only about 111 female personal names in the scriptures of Israel, representing a mere 9% of the characters in the Old Testament or the First Testament or the Hebrew Bible. So if only 9% of the characters in the Hebrew Bible are women, we want to like lift up the names of these women, right? We don't want to just call them the daughters of their father. They should have their own story and their own name. If we do get to have their names in the text, then we should try to lift those up. So I'm going to try my best to use their names throughout this story. I think, it's easier too because there's quite a few of them. It's easier sometimes to just be like those over there, but they have their own names. And so we're going to try to honor that, knowing how important names are, especially to lots of folks like us, lots of trans folks that have names that are very important to us, right? Alex says, I never learned about them in church. Yeah, it's true. This is, like I said, this is a story that is kind of passed over because it's in a couple of different places throughout a couple of different books. And so because it's not all in one place and because it's about women, it tends to get skipped over a little bit. So that's the first thing about names that I wanted to just think about for a second. The second thing that I wanted to think about is why these women are coming forward to Moses and to the priest. Why are they specifically coming forward to ask about land and inheritance? And the background to this text is that Moses in the book of Numbers is taking a big census of all of the people of Israel because essentially the idea is as soon as they get to the promised land, when they are all going to live there, the idea is that each tribe of Israel, so there's 12 tribes of Israel, each tribe is going to get the amount of land in proportion to the number of people they have in the tribe. So like the bigger tribes are going to have more land, the littler tribes are going to have less land, right? So the whole plan here is that Moses is trying to get a census so he can figure out how to portion out the amount of land in their new home for each tribe. And so that's why this land question is coming up, is because the tribe of Manasseh, who's one of the tribes, they're talking about their land. And these women who are members of the tribe of Manasseh are like, hey, wait a second. Everybody else has land and we didn't get any. And it's like not our fault and it's not our father's fault. And like we should be able to have land, right? So that's why we've got this. That's why we've got these women coming forward to kind of stake their claim. Another thing that Dr. Gaffney brought up that I didn't really think about before is in this first bit that I just read. This is what so I'm going to read this bit again, what the women say, starting in verse 3. Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the company of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the company of Korah, they were sort of a group of people that rose up against God and Moses and tried to have their own little revolutionary thing, and it didn't work out well for them. So these women are saying, our father was not in that group of people. He was not a bad guy. Instead, they say in verse 4, why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he has no son? Give to us a possession among our father's brothers. So the thing that Dr. Gaffney pointed out in her book that I hadn't really thought about is that the women are not coming forward they're not really asking for something. They're kind of just saying, hey, this is ours already. Just like make this happen. Like they're demanding rather than requesting in a way. And I think that's really, it's really an interesting point to note, especially as we go on in the story, that the women aren't coming forward and being like, hey, do you think we could have, maybe, would it be all right? They're coming up and they're like, this is what we are owed. This is our ancestral inheritance, and we should have it, right? So they're really being very sort of forthright and like brave, really, in the face of a system that wouldn't want to give them land because they're women, right? So that's something to note here, that they don't necessarily ask, they kind of demand. So let's read the second little bit of this text. And as always, I'm going to be kind of stopping in little chunks here as we kind of think about this stuff. But if you have thoughts about any of this stuff and what's going on in the text, feel free to put it in the chat, because this is kind of a chock full story. Yeah, Golden Heart. Most churches don't do a lot of exploration in the Hebrew or Greek, because I think there's a sense that maybe people, I don't know. I was told once by a professor that we shouldn't sort of bog people down by adding all that extra stuff by like saying, well, in the Greek it says, or in the Hebrew it says, because maybe it sounds a little bit like uppity, a little bit like I know better than you because I learned this stuff in school or whatever. But I think it can be really helpful for people to think about where this came from. It helps to give us some context sometimes to remember, like, you know, things that were written in a completely different time and place really are like in a completely different language, culturally and linguistically, like literally. So yeah, that's why I like talking about the Hebrew and the Greek. Hey, Eaton, I'm glad you're here too. Awesome. So let's read the second part of our story here, the second part of this part of the story. So again, we're in Numbers chapter 27. And we are going to read verses 5 through 11. So the second part of this chapter. So it says, Moses brought their case before the Lord. So Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah, they bring their case to Moses, and then Moses brings their case before the Lord. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, the daughters of Zelophehad are right in what they are saying. You shall indeed let them possess an inheritance among their father's brothers, and pass the inheritance of their father on to them. You shall also say to the Israelites, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall pass his inheritance on to his daughter. And if he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers. And if he has no brothers, you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the nearest kinsman of his clan, and he shall possess it. It shall be for the Israelites a statute and ordinance as the Lord commanded Moses. So in the second part of this particular part of the story, we get Moses kind of being Moses is acting as sort of an intermediary, like for God. Like God is the one deciding this stuff, but Moses is kind of like carrying the information back and forth, right? So the sisters bring their problem to Moses and they say, we demand our land. And then Moses goes to God and says, what do I do about these women? And then God says, the women are right. Like they're right in what they ask for. And so from now on, here's the new precedent that women are going to be able to inherit land if they have no brothers specifically. And then if there are no girls either, then this will happen and this will happen and so on and so forth, right? So there's a new precedent being set here. Robin says, what I find interesting is that the faith seems to evolve in light of the new situation. Yeah, exactly. So the idea here is that like Moses is known among the Israelites and among Jewish folks today as like the lawgiver, right? Moses is the one who's like codifying all of these laws in these books of the Bible. And so this is very much a time where the law is still being written like in real time. And so when people would bring a problem to Moses, he'd be like, well, crap, we don't have a rule about this yet. I got to go ask God. I'll be right back. So yes, the law is very much being written in the moment that this story is happening. Noah says, did the Israelite people not have enough inheritance to split between all their children? Right. So the idea is that each father would have a certain amount of land, and rather than splitting up that land among all of his children, he would just give the land usually to the oldest son. That was usually the person to inherit. And the idea was that way the land wouldn't get fragmented into like smaller and smaller bits. They were trying to keep all of the land together. And so that's why usually only the oldest son would inherit. And that was a thing like through like the Middle Ages and through up until not pretty recently in like in human history that comes out of these particular stories. This idea of the oldest son inheriting is pretty common. Brian says, Robert Alter points out that in a case like this, a priest might be expected to turn to the Urim and Thummim or some such divination, but Moses goes directly to God. That's really interesting. So Robert Alter is he's an Old Testament scholar, and so he's somebody who knows what he's talking about a lot, pretty much most of the time. Although I do disagree with him on some things, but Robert Alter knows a lot about the Old Testament. But yes, so there was a case where, or there was a system whereby if you wanted to know the answer to a question or wanted to know what to do about something, you could go to the priest in the temple, or in this case, because there's no temple yet, you would go to the tabernacle. And the priest had these two sort of stones, and one sort of meant yes or positive, and one sort of meant no or negative. And the idea was that you could ask the priest to ask God what you should be doing about a thing. And so, yeah, in some cases, it might be that they would ask a priest, but because Moses is there and Moses is sort of like the divine lawgiver and messenger, there's kind of no need. Like they're coming before Moses and Eleazar the priest at the same time. But since Moses kind of has like the direct line to God, they kind of don't need to mess with, like Eleazar is kind of, the priest is kind of unnecessary in this particular story. He's there because he's important in the community, but he's not the one that's going to be making the rules at the end of the day. That's going to be God and then Moses. So that's what we have going on here in this story. So God says, you know what? These women are right. They deserve their inheritance. So from now on, here's the new rule. Here's the new law. So that's where things are kind of set up. So we're going to scoot on over to the second part of our story, which we can read about just a few chapters later. So this is going to be in Numbers chapter 36. And it's pretty much the whole chapter, but it's only 12 verses, so it goes fast. So Numbers chapter 36 is the next thing that we're going to read. I'm going to have a drink of water while we scoot on over there. All right. So Numbers chapter 36 is where we're at. And I'm going to read verses 1 through 4 to get us started, and then we're going to talk a little bit about that. Yes, Numbers chapter 36. So verses 1 through 4 go like this. The heads of the ancestral houses of the clans of the descendants of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, of the Josephite clans, came forward and spoke in the presence of Moses and the leaders, the heads of the ancestral houses of Israelites. So, again, this is everybody getting all together. They're talking, and this is essentially the tribe of Manasseh, so the same tribe that the women that we just talked about are from. And they said, the Lord commanded my Lord, so they're saying the Lord commanded Moses, to give the land for inheritance by lot to the Israelites. And my Lord was commanded by the Lord to give the inheritance of our brother Zelophehad to his daughters. But if they are married into another Israelite tribe, then their inheritance will be taken from the inheritance of our ancestors and added to the inheritance of the tribe into which they marry. So it will be taken away from the allotted portion of our inheritance. And when the Jubilee of the Israelites comes, then their inheritance will be added to the inheritance of the tribe into which they have married, and their inheritance will be taken from the inheritance of our ancestral tribe. So this is getting a little bit inside baseball in terms of inheritance and who gets what. But essentially what's happening here is that the men of the tribe of Manasseh are coming forward to Moses and they're saying, hey, we heard what you said about the land going to those women from our tribe, and that would not work out well for us, because essentially the way this would work is that these women would be given land that was their father's, and then as soon as they marry, that land essentially becomes the property of their husband because of the sort of patriarchal system that they're in. So if the women from the tribe of Manasseh marry somebody who's from a different tribe, that land sort of becomes the land of that other tribe by default. So the men of the tribe of Manasseh are kind of like, hey, this is not good for us, because like, it's nice that you gave these women land and all, but they're going to essentially be giving it away as soon as they get married. And then that land won't belong to our tribe anymore. Does that make sense? So that's their main concern, that the land won't belong to the tribe of Manasseh anymore. And I wonder what you think about the differences and similarities between these two cases that are brought forward. So there's the case of the women of Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah, that they come forward and they say, we want our ancestral land. And then there's the case of the men of Manasseh coming forward and saying, we actually don't think this would be great for us. So I wonder what you think the similarities and differences are between the two groups that are coming forward, between these two perspectives, between the ways that they're asking for this or demanding it, or what do you see the similarities and differences being between these two groups? That's my first question for us. One of the things that I'm going to talk for a second while you're typing. One of the things that I notice is that the women in chapter 27 come forward and essentially demand something. They say, this is our ancestral right, and we demand this, right? And I see something slightly different in the other one, but I want to go to what Robin says here. Robin says they are both demanding land, but one is demanding the land because it's their right, and the other is demanding land for status. Interesting. Yeah, there's this, like, it seems like the difference that I see there, and tell me, Robin, if I'm not getting your idea right here, but it's kind of like you've got a group of people that are coming forward and saying, we don't have any land, we would like some. And then a group of people coming forward and saying, we already have a lot of land and we don't want to lose that, right? So there's a difference there in like the people who don't have anything and feel that they should, and the people who already have a bunch of stuff and are worried that it's going to get taken away. So there's kind of a difference there. So Robin, tell me if I'm misconstruing that, but that seems to be kind of what you're saying. Carolyn says the head of the household or heads of the household aren't named, which makes them seem less important as they are only referenced in relation to their ancestors. Yeah, right. So that's a big thing, right? In Numbers 27, we get the names of the women that are coming forward, but then in Numbers 36, we don't get their names right away. We just hear that they're the heads of the ancestral clans of the blah 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 blah, right? So we don't get their specific names. So it does give you this sense of like the people that are named are usually people that are kind of more important. So yeah, I like noticing that too. The thing that I was going to say that I notice is that the women that are coming forward, their specific wording is, give to us a possession among our father's brothers. It's very much a demand, right? When the men of Manasseh come forward, they don't actually ask for anything. They don't actually, like, they basically outline the problem that they see, but they don't give any better solution or ask for anything specific. They just say, here's the situation, Moses, this is bad. And they don't really offer another possible answer, right? So, Eaton, I was just saying that the book of Numbers is all about the people of Israel and the different tribes and the amount of, there's a big numbering taking place. So they're getting the numbers of everybody. And then depending on how many people you have in your tribe, you get assigned a certain amount of land. So this story is all about people arguing about who gets what land. And the reason that it's important is because we're essentially, kind of like Robin said, we're looking at two groups of people that are both talking about their inheritance or their land. And one group of people is a group that is kind of hasn't been allowed to have land before because they're women. And the other group is a group of men that seem to be very upset about the idea of losing any land at all. So that's the large theme of this story here. So yeah, as I was saying, I think it's interesting to notice that the men that come forward from Manasseh aren't necessarily saying, here's what we want, or here's another possible solution. They're just saying, this is a problem, Moses. So that's kind of what we've got here, ending in verse 4. So let's read the second half of this bit of the story. So chapter 36, verses 5 through 12 is what we're going to read next. So the men come forward and they say, here's the problem, Moses. We don't want to lose our land. Then Moses commanded the Israelites according to the word of the Lord, saying, the descendants of the tribe of Joseph are right in what they are saying. This is what the Lord commands concerning the daughters of Zelophehad. Let them marry who they think is best, only it must be into a clan of their father's tribe that they are married, so that no inheritance of the Israelites shall be transferred from one tribe to the other. For all Israelites shall retain the inheritance of their ancestral tribes. Every daughter who possesses an inheritance in any tribe of the Israelites shall marry one from the clan of their father's tribe, so that all Israelites may continue to possess their ancestral inheritance. No inheritance shall be transferred from one tribe to another, for each of the tribes of Israel of the Israelites shall retain its own inheritance. The daughters of Zelophehad did as the Lord had commanded Moses. Mahlah, Tirzah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Noah, the daughters of Zelophehad, married sons of their father's brothers. They were married into the clans of the descendants of Manasseh, son of Joseph, and their inheritance remained in the tribe of their father's clan. So, thoughts on how Moses tries to resolve this situation? Carolyn immediately goes to the big question that feminist scholars have been asking about this story, which is, did God actually say that the daughters should marry within the tribe, or did Moses say that to keep the peace? This is the big question that feminists have been asking about this story, because for a couple of reasons. The main one is the difference between how Moses responds in these two stories, right? In the first story, we get Moses, and in chapter 27, it says, Moses brought their case before the Lord, and the Lord spoke to Moses saying, and then says what to do, right? But in this chapter, in chapter 36, it says, then Moses commanded the Israelites according to the word of the Lord saying, and then Moses says something, right? So there's been a question about whether or not Moses is actually doing what God wants. Did Moses actually bring this to God and say, God, what should we do? Or was Moses trying to find a good way to Moses was trying to mediate, to find a middle ground. So that's the big question that people have been asking about this text for a long time. So Alex says, I think it's interesting that it says they can marry who they think is best, though. They have some freedom in it, at least. They're not forced into arranged marriages. It's not just the man's decision. Yes, exactly. So it's like, usually what would happen is your father or your mother as well would help decide who you were going to marry as a woman at that time. And because their father is dead, they essentially get to make their own choices about who they get to marry. So that's good. But it means that like the sort of compromise that Moses comes to is you can marry anybody you like as long as it's within the tribe of Manasseh, because then the tribe doesn't lose their land, right? So there's this compromise that happens here. And then we hear at the end, verse 10, it says, the daughters of Zelophehad did as the Lord had commanded Moses. They married sons of their father's brothers. So again, we've got this statement, as the Lord commanded Moses. And there's this question of like, did God really command Moses? Maybe, maybe not, because it's interesting to have two stories that are this alike. And then you also get like there's the same language that's used, right? Where in chapter 27, God says, the daughters of Zelophehad are right in what they are saying, right? And then in Numbers 36, we read, the descendants of the tribe of Joseph are right in what they are saying, right? So it's the same language even around the response, but the Numbers 27 response from God is very specifically, this is what God says, whereas the response in chapter 36 is a little bit like, we don't know. We don't know who said this. It's a little weird. Robin says, well, there's precedence for Moses mediating and not speaking for God according to Jesus, just to throw that out there. Yeah. So this is part of the problem, is that Moses is not known for being flawless. Moses is not known for always getting God's will right. And so Moses doesn't have a great track record, which is why people are kind of doubtful about what's going on here, right? Sky says, in the NIV, the phrasing is, then at the Lord's command, Moses gave this order to the Israelites. Right. So yeah, the idea, the same idea that like God is commanding Moses to say this, but because we don't get verbatim what God is saying, it seems a little bit up to Moses's discretion in terms of how he understands what God is saying. So it's complicated. It's very complicated. So essentially, Moses does what I think is kind of a human thing and kind of says, I've got two people, they disagree, let's find middle ground. So Moses tries to find some middle ground, or maybe God decides this middle ground, either way. And they end up in the middle here, where the women can marry whoever they want, as long as they're part of the tribe of Manasseh, and then no land gets lost. Yeah, so Brian really bringing this like big picture here. Brian says, I actually have that same question about much of the Torah. How much came from God, how much from Moses, and how much from the editors who put these books together later? That's the, what is it? The $10,000, $100,000 question. I think that's something that is people have very different opinions on that, obviously. And I don't know that it's something that we have a definitive answer to. In terms of, if you are somebody, like my position is as somebody who believes that Scripture is that Scripture is God-breathed, right? But that we also recognize that human beings had to actually put a pen to paper to write down these words, and that in that sort of game of telephone, things can get lost in translation, right? So everybody's going to have a different feeling about this, about how much you can attribute to any kind of specific source. But that's why I think it's important to recognize that even people in the Bible, can misread what God is saying. And that seems to be something that is actually a kind of a common theme throughout Scripture, that God will tell somebody something and they'll get like 60% of it. And so I don't think it's heretical in any way for us to question that when we read the Bible, to say like, what could humans have possibly heard wrong when they were trying to write this down, right? So yeah, I think that's an important question to ask. Alex said, I grew up in Christian circles where people said everything in the Old Testament was a literal direct quote from God. Yep. That's a very common way of understanding the text. And I think it's much harder to understand the text that way when you learn more about the culture and the history of the text. So yeah, it's a tough conversation to have. So I'm glad that we are here in a place where we can talk and say, like, here's a theory. I really try to give you all as many possible theories as I find out about and know about, because I think it's important to be able to look at that, all the possibilities, and say, well, here they all are. And I'm not saying I'm not trying to get us to believe one specific thing over another, but I think knowing about all the possibilities can help us understand kind of it's the richness of the text and the richness of faith. If all faith was just like banana pudding all the time and all tasted the same, that would be pretty bland, especially if you don't like banana pudding. But if faith is like a banquet table with 8 million different kinds of food, that's way better, right? That can feed us all of our lives. We can't live on banana pudding all our lives. So I hope that's what we can do here as we're looking at these stories. So let's move on to, was there anything else that I wanted to say about this Numbers text? Oh, okay. So the last question that we have to kind of think about is whether or not it's really that the compromise that Moses is trying to put forward, whether or not that really is a compromise. Because essentially what seems to be happening here is that the women would inherit land, but then immediately get married to somebody, and then the land becomes part of, that, like, her husband's purview then after that point. So it's a little bit complicated when you think about whether or not these women, like, it might be better for them to be able to own the land by themselves and not get married. And that seems like it might have been an option, maybe, except we hear at the end of chapter 36 where it says that they all did end up marrying sons of their father's brothers, right? So we do have this sort of end of this chapter where it's like, well, the compromise was made. Here's what we decided to do. Now what, right? So, I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything in the chat. Okay, cool. So the last bit of this story that we are going to read about actually takes place in an entirely different book. So we've been reading in the book of Numbers. So after Numbers is the book of Deuteronomy, which is sort of Moses's big last address to the people. And then at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses dies, right? And before Moses dies, Moses passes on the leadership to, I know, Robin says, curveball, gasp. Yes, Moses dies, surprise, at the end of Deuteronomy. And he passes on his leadership to a guy named Joshua. So Joshua becomes the new leader of Israel. So when that happens, the people are brought into this land that they've all parceled out, like everybody's decided where everybody's going to live. And Joshua leads the people into this land to get all settled. And so that's where we're going to read the last part of this story. So it's in Joshua chapter 17. So Joshua 17, we are going to be reading from, there we go, verse 3 to verse 6. So it's just 3 verses. And this is the last sort of part of this story proper. It's kind of amazing. These women are actually named several more times within the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. They're just sort of name dropped as like, hey, remember these women? They inherited land. So they're actually, these women are named second of all the women in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. These women are named the second most after Miriam. Miriam, Moses' sister, gets the most mentions of any woman. But then these women actually get the second most. So Joshua chapter 17, verses 3 through 6 is what we're reading. So it goes like this. Now, remember now, this is like long after, so we have to be kind of reminded of who these people are right at the beginning. Now Zelophehad, son of Hepher, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, had no sons, but only daughters. And these are the names of his daughters: Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They came before the priest Eleazar and Joshua, son of Nun, and the leaders, and said, "The Lord commanded Moses to give us an inheritance along with our male kin." So according to the commandment of the Lord, he gave them an inheritance among the kinsmen of their father. Thus there fell to Manasseh 10 portions, besides the land of Gilead and Bashan, which is on the other side of the Jordan, because the daughters of Manasseh received an inheritance along with his sons. The land of Gilead was allotted to the rest of the Manassites. So here we have the end of this story. And essentially what happens is that it sounds like Moses never actually gave the women their allotted portion like he said he was going to. They get married to the sons of their brothers, like Moses said, this is what we're going to do. And then they did it, but then they never actually got the land. So it's not until Moses' successor, Joshua, shows up that the women have to go back and remind the new person in charge that this was what the agreement was going to be. And essentially, you haven't paid up yet. So don't forget, we need this land, right? So they go back and they remind Joshua that this is what the deal is going to be. And Joshua, interestingly enough, he doesn't go to God. He doesn't go to Eleazar and ask Eleazar, like, hey, did this actually happen? Like, he doesn't go and check with anybody. He just says, okay, according to the commandment of the Lord, he gave them an inheritance among the kinsmen of their father. So for Joshua, it seemed to be like kind of figured out, basically Moses kind of figured it out, and then Joshua just had to follow through. So it's interesting to think about how it took so much from these women to come forward and actually get their what they deserved, right? To get their inheritance. They had to come the first time, they had to come back the second time and marry the people that their male family members thought they should marry. And then they had to come back a third time to Joshua and say, okay, for real though, are we going to get the thing you promised us? So that's kind of the end of the story of these women. And like I said, they're mentioned again in a couple of other texts, but this is kind of the sort of compressed version of their story is through these 3 texts. So the whole reason that I wanted to talk about these women is because I've been thinking a lot about advocacy, right? A lot about how we advocate for ourselves and for each other as LGBTQ plus folks and as LGBTQ plus Christians. Robin says, oh, that makes me think of the parable of the woman who kept going to the judge. Yeah. So I was actually just reading that parable recently as well. So Jesus tells a parable in the Gospels about it's called the parable of the unjust judge. And essentially the story Jesus tells is that there was once this judge who didn't respect God and didn't care about people. And this woman who was a widow kept coming to him and requesting justice and demanding justice. And even though he was not a just person and he didn't really care, he essentially agreed to give her justice just to get her to stop bugging him. And it's kind of a squeaky wheel gets the grease kind of story. But yes, this story is kind of similar in that we get these women who just repeatedly come forward and ask for what is theirs and demand what is theirs and eventually do get it. And you kind of have to wonder, like, by the time they get to Joshua, were they just like, was Joshua just like, these women, they just keep coming back, like, just give them what they want. So yeah, they show an incredible amount of courage and chutzpah, I think is probably the right word. So let's think about this kind of from our perspective as LGBTQ plus folks or as Christians or both. When we think about advocating for ourselves, I think this is a story kind of like we talked about a few Bible studies ago. We talked about the story of the prodigal son. Remember that? And we talked about how when we think about that story, we often think about ourselves as just one of the characters. Like we tend to think of ourselves as like just the lost son, or as the son who stayed home, or as the father sometimes, right? This is another story where I think it's interesting to think of ourselves as the people in the story. When do we sometimes feel like these women? When do we feel like, now I'm going to get their names right again, Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah? When do we feel like them, as if when we're coming forward and we are demanding our inheritance, right? When do we feel like the men of Manasseh who are coming forward and are saying, I'm not thrilled about this idea of letting other people have what I have, right? When do we come forward in that sort of concern of not being sure about these newfangled ideas? I think sometimes we're those people. And when are we Moses? When do we try to find sort of the best middle ground, even when maybe God's saying something different, but like we just kind of want to make everybody happy and make everybody stop fighting? And when are we Joshua, the person who has been given charge of something that we didn't really have we had no background in this, we're just trying to do our best, and we respond to what people are asking us for, right? So I think we can kind of be any of these sort of four people at different times in our lives. In this really wonderful tome here, this is called Torah Queries. And this is a book from Jewish scholars, queer Jewish scholars, specifically about Torah portions. So in Christian churches, if you're familiar with the lectionary in sort of mainline Christian denominations, and also in the Catholic Church, you have a lectionary where you have like a prescribed reading for each Sunday of the week, and sometimes more. This is similar. So in Jewish settings, you have a Torah portion for the week. And so you've got a portion of one of the first 5 books of the Bible that's read every Saturday, right? So this is kind of like the Jewish lectionary, queer lectionary textbook. And when I was reading the section on this particular story, I found this passage that kind of reminded me of this sense of like we could be one of these 4 situations, right? So I'm just going to read you a little quote from this passage. This passage is by a person named Amber Powers, is the person who wrote this chapter. And they say, the fight for justice and equality is ongoing and not a linear path. There are often real conflicting values that must be acknowledged and negotiated. I view Moses' ruling in favor of the heads of the clan, requiring the daughters to marry within their own tribe, as his attempt to balance the right of women to inherit and the custom of continuing hereditary lines through land ownership. Like Moses, there will be times when we are in a leadership role, and it may feel as if no solution will meet the needs and demands of all the individuals and people in our communities. Like the heads of the family clan in this Torah portion, there may be times when we personally stand in a place of privilege, and we would risk losing something if we supported another's fight for change. Like the daughters of Zelophehad, there are times when we will submit to a less than fully just solution to a compromise, a temporary measure, or because we have no choice. Nevertheless, we must remain clear about our vision of justice and equality and continue to work for the fullest expression in our communities and in our practices. I imagine that the 5 daughters of Zelophehad may also have disagreed about exactly how hard to push and when to accept that they had done as much as they would be able to do. These conversations within our communities, even when we passionately disagree, are important because they keep us talking about our visions for justice. Oh yes, this is Torah Queries. It's a big tome here. So that particular, a couple of things that author said really hit home for me as I was thinking about us as queer Christians. The thing that they said about how the daughters of Zelophehad, these 5 women, they might have disagreed about what justice looked like and what they were actually requesting from the leaders. And they might have disagreed about whether Moses's solution was the one that they should go ahead with. And I wish that we got some more behind the scenes on their conversation about how they were going to respond to what Moses said, right? Because you can kind of imagine that they they maybe came away from that first meeting thinking like, oh, this is great. We're finally going to get what we deserve, right? We're finally going to get our inheritance. And then they might come away from the second meeting feeling kind of discouraged because now all these like particular things are all these rules are laid on top of it about who they're allowed to marry. But then they would come away from the third one finally having the land that they asked for. But they've now also got these husbands that maybe they didn't want. So I think it reminds me a lot of how queer Christians and LGBTQ plus folks, we disagree sometimes about what the best course of action is for justice, right? Sometimes we, and especially in the case of churches, right? If you are a queer or trans person in the church, you might sometimes feel like your church is going the completely wrong, like going the absolute wrong way. That they're maybe they're not becoming affirming, or they're not taking the steps. Like, even though you and other queer folks in the church have told them time and time again, like, this is what we need to do in order to make this an affirming space, they're not doing that, right? There are times when we disagree over what justice is going to look like and how we're going to make that happen. And so that resonated with me when I was thinking about how change happens when we think about being these four people. So I wonder if there are other ways that you see our communities or us as individuals falling into these sort of four categories: the people that demand justice, the people that are a little bit scared about justice happening because we might lose some stuff, the people that are doing their best as leaders to kind of make compromises, and the people that are trying to respond as quickly as possible to the needs that are out there. I wonder if any of those sort of positions resonate with you and how you see LGBTQ plus Christians existing. I think for me, I definitely feel like there are times when I'm maybe too much like the men from the Manasseh tribe, right? I'm a little bit too worried about what I'm going to lose. I think we all, like, that's a human feeling. I think a lot of us have that feeling, especially if you maybe have experienced times in your life where you didn't get the justice that you had hoped for, right? I think it's very easy because, like, think about it this way. The tribe of Manasseh is one of the smallest tribes of the 12 tribes of Israel. They were one of the small ones. And so if you can imagine that, like, these people, these leaders from the tribe of Manasseh, maybe they are coming at this from a sense of like, we're not going to have any land left. They're feeling so much fear, right? They're feeling like, well, we know what it's like to be the smallest. We know what it's like to be picked on, right? We know what it's like to not have enough. And so that's where their fear is coming from. And I think it's very easy for us to have the same kind of thing happen. Like, for me, as a trans guy, I have a lot of fear about, about my safety, about my health, about things as a trans guy, because I've experienced marginalization as a trans guy. However, I also recognize that I have a lot of privileges that not all trans people have, right? And so I have to be careful to not let my fear get in the way of justice for my siblings, right? I can't be afraid to share. I can't be afraid to demand justice for other people, just because I've maybe experienced injustice in my life. And that's kind of a hard thing, I think, for us to hold. It's a hard thing to remember that we can't just advocate for ourselves. Like, this is such a great story when it comes to, like, people advocating for themselves. These women going forward and saying, like, this is what we deserve and this is what we need. And then God approving that and saying, yes, these women are doing the right thing, right? That's so important. But we can't end in only advocating for ourselves. We also have to advocate for those who have less than we have, right? Whether that's in material goods or in justice in general. We have to advocate not just for ourselves, but for other people in our community. And that's really important it can feel exhausting sometimes to be like, oh, well, is it never going to be over? Is the work never going to be over? And I think that's why it's important for us to take breaks, to take our Sabbaths, to remember that we are not in charge. At the end of the day, God is in charge. But we still need to be standing up for what's right, right? Robin says, I can feel that. I sometimes get scared of disclosing my trans status to new people at church because it's nice being treated like a woman without those little slips that people make with trans people. Yeah, I get that. I think actually, just as a last example, I painted my fingernails this week. They're purple. And it's something that I'm trying to do because I'm trying to be more visibly queer, because I pass as like a cis guy pretty much all the time. And I pass as a straight guy most of the time because I have a girlfriend. And I was thinking about the fact that when I walk in someplace and I see a guy who I read as cis or straight or both, with something that looks like, with using their gender expression in a way that feels a little bit more fluid, I immediately feel safer. I'm immediately like, oh, that guy might be okay. And like, that's not always true, but like, that's a feeling that I get. And I thought, I want to be able to be that for somebody else. I want people to see me and be like, well, that guy looks like, just your average dude, but he's got painted nails. And maybe that means that he is okay with people expressing their gender in a way that might be a little bit out of the box. And then they might feel a little bit safer having me around, right? So I think there are moments like that, Robin. Oh, thank you. Robin says they look good. I think there are things like that, Robin, where we can think about like, how can we, it may be that there are some weeks where we're just like, I cannot be visibly queer right now. I'm exhausted and I can't do it and I'm scared. But then there can also be weeks when we can say, you know what, I have a little bit of extra gas in the tank this week, and I'm going to take that time to try to make the world a safer and better and more just place for other people. So we really have to find ways to balance that, right? We can't be all out all the time and we can't be apathetic all the time. We've got to find ways to balance that. So yeah, I think maybe that's what we'll end with this story tonight, since we're all at time now. But I just thought this story was an interesting one in terms of thinking about our queer communities and people advocating for themselves and advocating for others. And I suppose the last thing I can drop in here is that there is one queer Torah study that I was just made aware of on Twitter from some queer Jewish women who were talking about how maybe all of these women were gay anyways. So that's maybe why they didn't want to get married, which I kind of love, the idea of a family of 5 sisters, all of them being like, really not into men. So that's another way you could go in terms of interpretation. So thanks for coming, everybody, tonight. That is your fun theology, your queer theology, your trans theology for the week. And I'm so glad that you were here. Thank you for being here. Thanks for everybody in the chat for sharing your stories and your experiences. The last couple things I will say. One, if you are ever wondering when these Bible studies happen or when the trans support groups happen, I put out an email newsletter once a month with updates on like when all these things are happening and where I'm going to be traveling, and news and resources that might be interesting to you if you're looking for more trans faith resources. So if you want to get on that email list, you can do that at my website. And I'll put that in the chat so that you have it. On my website, on the right-hand right-hand side of the resources page, I should have sent you the resources page. You can subscribe to, oh, wait, no, what? There it is. It's on this side. I'll put this in the chat. There, now you have it. On the right-hand side, there's a thing where you can sign up for the email list, and then you will know when all this stuff is happening, and you will get new resources, and it'll be a good old time. So you can sign up for the email list. Secondly, thank you to everybody over on the Patreon for supporting this work. You're amazing. I couldn't do this without you. So if you want to get involved in the Patreon, you can do that at patreon.com/AustinLionheart. And then third is our schedule. So the next time we're going to be meeting for our trans and Christian support group on the 11th of November, and then we'll have another Bible study on the 18th. So that's the news, and I will see you all next time. Thanks so much for being here. Have a good rest of your night.